after DS2.2 was published, we came together, well, gosh, way back. Someone was in response to the JSON report. We came together to work together to accelerate both the maturity and adoption of FHIR. The key things to kind of walk away from the Argonaut, we're not a separate business legal entity. We work with HL7. We're not a standards development organization. So when someone says I conform to Argonaut, most likely they're talking about the data query guide we published, but it's not a formal standard, you know. But again, it's guidance to the industry. But ultimately, we are an open, you know, once the priorities are set, we are an open forum for everyone to kind of participate and provide feedback to make things as consistent as possible within the priorities that are set. In terms of who participates, these are the original kind of technology vendors and provider organizations who pooled their resources to help get us started. So when I say pooled, they actually funded, so it's privately funded. There's no kind of government funding involved in Argonaut, which is different than how some standards are developed at HL7. And in terms of the contractor team, there's about 4 to 6 of us that float in and out depending on the project. So it's, but really the kind of secret sauce of Argonaut is vendors committing their developers to participate. So Josh and Graham and Eric and myself, we're important, but we're really not as important as the contribution from the software vendors giving their feedback of how their customers are using it and clients and how they would like that data. And as part of that, we're only able to take on so many projects at a time because the EHR vendors, they have limited resources that they're willing to contribute to the projects. And honestly, without their contribution, it's only real because they contribute and actually build software around this, and we learn through that process. Okay, so that's here's Argonaut. So kind of what do? We set priorities. So if you look at the DS2.2 resource list, I think even the Apple talk earlier had this on here. So there's 90 plus resources then. There's well over 100 now. And so, originally Argonaut, one of the things that was very powerful for me is I had written a guide kind of through a government agency called the Data Access Framework, and we had all these resources and all these elements, and we said, all right, vendors, everyone's going to implement this and life will be good. And the feedback very quickly was, well, multiple birth indicator is important. We'd like that data, but it's probably not the first thing we're going to work on. And so kind of mashing together what the government was asking for and what vendors were able to do. There was a rule came out in the US, and I know some folks are well-versed in the certification rules that have come out through ONC and the meaningful use programs, but a rule came out called the 2015 edition that named 18 data elements, and it was called the Common Clinical Data Set. And actually within these Common Clinical Data Sets, they did do something very helpful, is they actually kind of gave vocabulary requirements to go with that. So we were no longer kind of making up that you should use MOLINK, but the government was actually saying use MOLINK for laboratory. And so ultimately, looking at the Common Clinical Data Set, looking at kind of existing prior work in the Data Access Framework, we kind of honed in on, hey, let's move in on these 17 Common Clinical Data Set resources and do some piloting and testing and get it out there. One of the things that was a little different than prior projects is we actually spent, we spent a bunch of time on search criteria. So who's implemented every search functionality in the FHIR specification, right? It's crazy. It's really powerful. You have reverse includes, you have chaining all kinds of stuff together, and the number of kind of permutations there. If you're a new client developer, you can get lost pretty quickly. And so one of the first things, once we, obviously we looked at, all right, what are reasonable searches? Like, what do we actually expect EHRs to support? And so when you look at the profiles in the Argonaut specifications and the US core specification, there's about, sometimes it's only 1, but sometimes it's, 4 or 6 or 8 of these are the expected searches that you can expect the EHR or the FHIR server to support to give kind of a little more concrete guidance, date range searching for a specific lab result maybe, or searching for a whole medication list. Those are actually baked into the spec and something that we added based on the feedback of, I really don't know what the FHIR server supports. Spent a little bit of time on scope of response, like how much you will actually get back when you implement these searches. And then the last piece is kind of the content of, what's kind of the minimum set of data elements that are required to make a lab result, the observation resource, useful. There's a lot of stuff there, and part of it is developing these profiles to scope it down to that piece. So the main event for us, or I shouldn't say one of the bigger products that we've produced, is the Argonaut implementation guide that provides access to the common clinical data set. There's also a piece in there, and for folks who, another piece for certification is the kind of accessing kind of all using CCD. So that's another piece of the puzzle that's included in this particular implementation guide. The parallel guide, which I know I talked about prior, but I can't hammer it enough, is US Core, is the same thing as Argonaut, only it's on STU3. So Argonaut, DSTU2, US Core, STU3. In terms of vendor implementation, some vendors have started to look at STU3. It seems like most have deployed DSTU2 out to their customers, and STU3 is a likely version they'll release on the path to whenever R4 gets out there. So quick comparison just of profiles across those two standards, just so you can see it, because I don't want someone to come up to me and say, Brett, they're not exactly alike. Document reference, for some reason, was in Argonaut and didn't get put in US Core originally. US Core, we added a location profile, an organization profile, and a practitioner profile. We realized that it was a mistake to not include document reference, and so there's a kind of ballot for folks who track HL7Es. Like, there's an official ballot out right now. We're in reconciliation, and we'll publish it hopefully this summer. I say, it should get published later this summer, which will add those three resources: document reference, encounter, and practitioner role. So at that point, US Core will have full coverage of what was in the prior Argonaut DST2 specification. I have heard more than once that we should add an encounter profile back to DST2 because all the vendors are implementing it, and some have implemented it a little bit differently. So if that profile is of high interest to you, let me know. I don't know. I don't think it'll be a ton of work for us to do, but yeah, because if you have a lab result, you kind of want to know the context of the encounter or their vital sign. There's all kinds of things that folks have implemented encounter in their own way, and so we'll see. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about profiles, and I went back to some slides when we were teaching FHIR in 2014 or 15, and this was a slide courtesy of Lloyd where it says, profile is FHIR. You don't need any profiles to interoperate with FHIR. How many folks think this is true? So I put a big X up here, and Lloyd always gets mad at me whenever I do this, in that I think you can do some level of exchange without profiles. But the fact is, here's a really simple example. If you look at the condition resource, and I'm sorry, none of you can read this except to say, hey, there's a lot of elements up there, right? So if you're a new client, you look at this list, or even a server, it's like, well, all right, so we're going to start implementing this, and you look down the list, and you say, all right, so I got this patient, I got this identifier, okay, maybe I'll do that. A link to patient would be good for condition, and you go, oh, code. Well, code's pretty important. The code tells me what type of condition it is. And if you look in the spec, you'd say, well, it doesn't actually say exactly which vocabulary I could put there, so maybe you could put your own there, maybe you can. And so that's when I immediately think, the importance of kind of terminology and value set binding into these elements, without those things, these resources are incredibly powerful to give you kind of the initial structure and how things are intended to be exchanged, but without tying vocabulary in there, you don't know what to expect, and the ability to do clinical decision support or any kind of analytics or any additional thing on it, it's really a missing piece. And so this is kind of brand new looking at the base condition resource versus the US Core condition, where it's, all right, so we have the clinical status, and then 4 elements that are required: verification, the category of the problem, the code, and that code has a specific value set, and then who does this problem tie to? So it requires the patient. Now, I'm sure there's folks who'd say, well, this is 5 elements. You need more to classify a condition, and you're right. You can layer in those other elements. I'm not saying this is all you need, but the idea is this is the baseline expectation of, if you're going to exchange the condition resource, you better have these 5. And it'd be great if you use SNOMED or ICD-9 for your coding system, and that's all baked in and part of the kind of I won't call it secret sauce, but an important part of the kind of creation of profiles. Okay, so a little bit, I'm going to do a little bit of marching through kind of key components of the specification and highlight the things that I think are important or we spent a lot of time on. And this, the toolbar in the Argonaut data query is it's identical to the US Core, so because we copied a lot of the content forward. But the first piece is the general guidance page. If you're looking for a mapping of FHIR to the common clinical data set, it's there. So look at US Core, it maps to the US Core profile, and then the specific resource that goes with it. Another thing, I guess I mentioned this earlier this morning too, is the idea of must support. The quote from the FHIR specification is, when a profile does this, it shall make clear what kind of support is required. That's all that's all FHIR says when you create an IG. So it took us, I'm sad to say it took us 6 bullets to say exactly what must support means in US Core and Argonaut, but basically, if you have the value, you got to send it. And the reason is there's sometimes folks just don't have a value, or their system actually doesn't support that value, and we wanted to give them out for those things that weren't kind of always had to be there. And so that's where that came from. The idea, I guess the big word, extensible plus max value set. So extensible is kind of so if you have an element in a profile, so you have, let's say, the code, the problem code, you can put an extensible binding to a value set. And so that means you have to pick a concept from this list of codes. And if you don't, and there's not coverage for the code, you can pull in a different code and you can use that. Okay, but if it's the same as within this kind of list of codes, you have to use it. And one of the feedbacks we got was, hey, sometimes I just have text, and it's really valuable to expose text. So can you do that? And so we created this extensible plus max value set. I'm hoping we get something that's a little, I don't know, it's a mouthful to say. I still, even as I look at it, I'm like, I don't know. No one knows what that means unless they read the definition. Using UCOM, anyone who's used, so UCOM is the terminology for units, and we use it with lab results and vital signs, and sometimes when the lab sends it to you, they maybe don't follow UCOM, or you have a free text piece, you're not sure what to do with it, and so the capability, there's guidance in the spec to say, if you're not sure it's UCOM, here's how you send it, which is an important thing because it happens. So just a screenshot of the mapping of the guidance, the US Core to Common Clinical Data Set. And for folks who are watching, ONC hasn't published any official guidance. As implementers and standards developers, we're kind of always, what are our customers asking for? Where's the government wind blowing in the US? And there's rumblings of clinical notes and provenance coming in the next 6 months or a year or whenever the next rule drops. And so we're starting to look a little bit ahead to that. But for now, it's just, this isn't the full list. It got cut off. But you get a taste that hopefully, whatever does drop, we would add to US Core. OK, so let's take a peek at allergies. And I think I could pull this up, actually. So build.fhir.org IG. So you're in here. Oh, I guess this is the this is the continuous build version of it. So this is the latest and greatest, which will eventually be published at the H7 website. If you look at if you were to click the link at the bottom of the presentation, that would take you to the published version. But so if you look at allergy intolerance, you're going to see a very common pattern in our so this is the guy, and actually it's very clear at the very top. It says the continuous integration build. If I were to, here, I'll just show you what it looks like. So it's release 1.01 is the current release, and I'll just look at this to make sure there's nothing funky in that one. There shouldn't be, but OK. Here, I'll click this again. It's fine. Sorry. OK. So in the allergy intolerance profile, and this is a very common pattern through all of our profiles, is there's a little bit of background on the resource. There's here's how you expect to use it. And then we start to get, this isn't quite the meat. We debate a little bit about how much prose to include in these, but basically every allergy must have a status of the allergy, a verification, the code to tell you what they're allergic to, and then the actual reference to the patient resource. And then in here, we have this formal view. So there's a structured definition behind this for folks who want to grab that. A little bit of summary of the mandatory requirements, but the piece I think most people jump right to is the differential table here. If you want to see all the elements that are available for you, you can actually take a peek at the snapshot table, and that gives a view of, inside here, these are all the elements that are available in the allergy intolerance resource, the base resource, but this is what we profiled too. And if you look over here, these are the bindings. When I mentioned value sets, the required, if you click on this, this would take you to the kind of base FHIR specification on what does it mean to be required. But if you were to click on this binding, this takes you to the value set page, and this tells you the kind of allowed clinical statuses that are here. So you can use active, inactive, resolved at this slot. And so for those three particular elements, there are specific value sets that are allowed. And you also see in terms of this patient, it's referenced to a US core patient. So the idea is that you'd include a patient that follows the guidelines of the US core profile on patient. So that's a little quick look. Oh, I guess I'll go a little further here. I talk about, I said, oh, there's queries. So this one's actually pretty simple. And we'll look at another one here. It's basically the only query that we agreed to was basically, give me the patient's current allergies. We looked at doing date searches. We looked at kind of some other types. And the feedback, some vendors actually do support date searching on allergies, date searching on medications. But the feedback was, the reality is you want, the most kind of common use cases, I want the current allergies. I want the current medications. And don't make it hard to do that, to make it really easy to do that. And that's what ultimately got included in the publication of the allergy profile. OK, I did have these backed up here just in case we got stuck. OK, another profile, just to kind of to look at a little bit, another one to take a peek at is the patient profile. And I guess I'm going to pull it up because I think it's a little hard to read here. And actually, you know what? I'll just click right here. OK. Similar format. The patient profile, there's a whole bunch of other elements you'll notice. So, and I didn't go through and decode this because I think many of you have seen this, but the idea that the cardinality is 1 to star, you got to have at least 1. And then we disallowed animal. But the thing you'll see at the bottom, and I think we've gotten several questions on this before, is hey, you added a race extension or an ethnicity extension, but it only allows 0 or 1, and I want to record multiple races or multiple ethnicities. It's always important when you see kind of a reference out to an extension to open up that extension. Because if you were to look at this extension, did it open for me? Let me see if. Oh, no. Why aren't you opening? Oh, my internet's really slow. OK. When you were to actually look at, when you actually jump, it's saying you can have one of this type of extension, but inside that extension, you can repeat many race or ethnicity values. So it's always important when you see an extension that, to actually take a moment to look at it. We fought with HL7 about including race and ethnicity into the core patient because that's something that's it's a kind of required element in the US to capture for kind of care disparity. And the rest of the world looked at us because HL7 is an international organization and says, we can't, race and ethnicity, we don't collect that. It's a US thing. Sorry, guys. So that's why I have extensions. Not a big deal, but anyway. So if you look at this, this one, there's a few pieces to this extension in that you need to have, should support Hispanic or Latino, and then you can have as many other more detailed ethnicity codes, and then the actual text of, what the ethnicity is of that patient. So that is the quick look at the patient profile. There's a fair bit more in terms of the patient quick start in terms of searches. Of course, you can retrieve a patient by logical ID. And then there's some searching by identifier. So if you have an MRN, being able to look up by that identifier and code. And then we have kind of a series of combination searches of name and birth date, and sex. And we don't get into, I think we say a little bit about, you should at minimum have these types. When you're doing a search by lookup by demographic information, you should include at least 2 or 3 of these, but we don't get into any of the complexities of for MPI certainty or matching certainty. We've kind of left that one of those things, leave that outside the spec, but just kind of set a baseline of at least a few things that you could use for searching. Okay, the next kind of piece to highlight is this talk's over. Okay. So the extensions, we had race extension. There's this profile association extension. Hopefully you never have to look at it. It's used in the capability statement. Core ethnicity extension, a direct address, and then birth sex. That was a requirement that we communicate birth sex, and there's an extension to communicate birth sex. We'll see. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. So terminology. This is, it's one of these funny things. I think. There's 23 value sets in the spec, and it's really easy to overlook terminology. But it's how a lot of data gets coded, and how you manage terminology and how you update, because new codes are added all the time, codes are retired. I would say it's a fairly complicated thing and something to be thinking about up front. And I know there's a few terminologists in the room, so it's always dangerous. I use my words appropriately. But there are these value sets, and we'll take a peek at a few of these. But they're basically a collection of concepts to use at a certain spot. And we have slightly different kind of patterns to these. So this is the problem value set. So this is what you use to describe a problem. And this particular value set is composed. So if you look, I don't think folks can quite read this, but it says this value set comes from the code system, and SNOMED is in here with this very specific code to say no current problems, or include all codes from SNOMED where the concept is a, and it has this code, and then all concepts where is a is. It'd be nice to have the name next to that to say like it's a finding or whatever exactly these are. But when you take these kind of these rules saying underneath this hierarchy in SNOMED, you get thousands of codes. Okay, and so if you're to open the spec and you're open this right now, you would actually, fortunately, the FHIR tooling for this particular value set actually explodes and shows you all those concepts. And so it's important that with these intentional value sets that it's all the codes underneath there that you need to grab. Other value sets that are more compact or don't have the need to say all within this hierarchy sometimes are included directly inside the value set. So smoking status, in this case, there's 8 concepts there. And those concepts are just built into the value set. So the value set actually has those 8 concepts, and you can actually just import that in. But the important thing, I can't emphasize this enough, is that value sets change over time. We'll hopefully, we will do a release to make it clear things have changed. But actually, just having a strategy for how you're going to manage these changing. And for other, consolidated CDA, the document exchange paradigm, we didn't do a very good job up front exposing these value sets in a computable fashion. And so we're starting to try, at least on FHIR, to make sure that folks can grab them and not have to go to SNOMED and download them, and go to get RxNorm over here and Link over here, but we're trying to curate them for you so not every single person is chasing down these value sets. Okay, another part in the spec, we have one operation, the docref operation. This is just it's kind of a convenience factor. Some vendors wanted the capability to generate a CCD on the fly. So basically either return one that was already generated or actually create one when requested. The reason this is, I don't know if this would have made it into the US core. Well, it didn't make it in the original US core spec, but I don't know if the Argonauts would have necessarily implemented this feature right away, except it was a requirement in the certification rule, it was G8. You had to be able to provide kind of this document summary piece, and so this is where that comes from. But yeah, it definitely is useful to get a whole chunk of data, but you're going to have to process CCD when you call this. And I know some of you love CCD, some of you do not love CCD. Okay, another piece of the spec is the capability statement. It was renamed to capability statement STU3, formerly the conformance statement. How many folks have a capability statement? Okay, how many people have a FHIR server? Okay, most of the same hands. All right, so if you have a FHIR server, you need to have, that was probably a bad question, actually, looking around. You need to have a capability statement, all right? It's a base requirement of the FHIR specification that you declare what you support. And so as a client application, one of the first things you can do is say, give me your capability statement, and you can see what that server supports, and it can then define how you interact with that particular server. I think there's dreams of, dynamic creation and, on the client side, being able to grab that and, dynamically change how you interact. And I think that is something that, may come in the future. Clients are all supposed to have a capability statement, and we give examples of both of these in the specification. Just to give you a little flavor of what it looks like in the spec, it's a little blurry. Basically, all the profiles, so the best, Argonaut FHIR server or US Core FHIR server would state that they support all the profiles that are in there, okay? And then also as part of that, so you can see here it says, all right, this particular capability statement says I support the patient profile. And then also, they're capable of returning a patient with get patient ID, also able to do it with get patient identifier, and then talks about kind of the different kind of combination of search parameters in there. So the capability statement has kind of a block for each of these, and it's a requirement, again, a FHIR that you support returning a capability statement. Yeah, and you may find when you query an Argonaut or US core server, all 17 profiles are not included, or all the search criteria we set forth are not included. But it's intended to be kind of the base. But we know EHR servers deviate a little bit from it. So the future, where are we headed? For Argonaut, there's a few projects going on. We have the bulk data. We're supporting bulk data, questionnaire, question response, and then clinical notes. That's the big thing for this year. Clinical notes and questionnaires are all kind of tied to R3 profiles. So that's Argonaut work, US core work. We're going to get that published this summer. And then ultimately, my dream, gosh, dream big, Brett, is that Argonaut continues on this, hey, we're going to do some implementation testing. We're going to try out kind of the new resources, the new scenarios. And then once it's stabilized, handing it over to HL7 so it's actually formally balloted and then locked in a way that we're not going to just go change it on you. And so there's a bit more, not that we're going to do a lot of changing to the Argonaut profiles, but you have kind of greater stability, and this is a standard. And if there are regulatory things in the US where they need to point to a standard, you'll be able to, that stability will be there. I couldn't help, whenever I start talking about data, I can't help but think a little bit about like data versus narrative, and maybe this is a little cheesy, but I can't help myself. Some of us have kids or nephews or have a taste of what that's like. And I had a son who had a daycare, okay, and I got a ton of data, okay. I knew exactly when he ate, I knew when he slept, I knew when he pooped, I knew everything about it. But when he came home from school, or when we, school, okay, daycare, so you'd say like, well, how was his day? Like how did he do? Was he happy today? Was he sad? I'm sure they could have added a smiley face. And so this is what we actually got from one of his schools. There's tons and tons of data, but we didn't actually know how he did, okay? Now, another school, we didn't get any data, but we got a paragraph twice a week. So I'll just pause for a second. If folks can read, yeah. Okay, so we learned that there's this behavior experimentation, and some of you are probably laughing because you're like, holy cow, I'm like, maybe not the shoe bin, but I'm sure there's something you're dealing with. I'm told it's supposed to go away as they get older, right? This is, so this kind of gives us the, all right, so, my transition of care home with my child, right? Of like, all right, so he's experimenting at school, like, what is this going to look like for us at home? And gave us kind of a, something to, better, he was like 3 at the age. I don't want to blow it up to a big deal, but it gave us kind of a better story of what was actually going on for our child. And he was our kids moved around a lot. At another school, we got nothing. So I think about parallel to healthcare of like, you get a lot of data, you get the story, or you get nothing. But I guess my whole point of this is like, don't lose the story. So I know we talk a lot about how to like exchange discrete data, and that's what the data query and US core guides are all about. But there's a story behind it. And I guess I'm really excited that within the Argonaut project right now, we're working on clinical notes. And for folks who know, I've been excited about this for a while because we did some work in consolidated CDA. I still work on that lovely thing, to exchange notes. And we spent a lot of time defining the common clinical notes set, which is kind of a joke. It's not any official thing except the term we use internally in the Argonaut project, where Meditech, the VA, Epic Cerner, a few other folks contributed their most common notes in their system. And we had a list of about 8 or 10. And as we started to test, we learned, man, getting nursing notes and lab and imaging, some of these things are going to be fairly complicated out of the gate. And the goal of Argonaut is to have kind of folks out of the gate working with some specific things. And so we said, so please don't be mad at me when I say we've scoped it to these 5, discharge, consultation, history, and physical. But those are the ones we're focused on. We had our first round of testing. Well, we did some testing in May, but when we first started talking about this, we spent a lot of time talking about, okay, well, if it's this type of note, you'd use this resource, diagnostic report or observation. And we went, oh, man, this is really complicated. There's thousands of note types. I remember I worked at a site in California that was like every doc had their own note type. It was like oh, I almost used their abbreviation. So I'll say California doctor's name note, progress note. So anyway, so we flipped it around and said, all right, let's talk about formats. Like, what are the formats? Like, what's the type of, what do we expect when we have notes exposed? And we said, all right, we could get text or XHTML, could get RTF or PDF, or maybe a mixed structured kind of document thing, which is, you can think of that as, CDA, people who know that in terms of where there's narrative and structure, or it could be the composition resource. But, there's kind of different formats, and how are we going to get it and access that? Just here's a really simple progress note example, kind of the header, subjective, objective assessment and plan for folks who know the SOAP note as an example that we've looked at. But ultimately started to test with the idea of using a document reference resource along a set of scenarios. So how do I retrieve an encounter summary note with a document reference ID? How do I retrieve all notes by patient? That was kind of a fun one because we started with, and I say fun, this is all under development right now, is we just said, oh, document reference is supposed to point to different notes. Just give me all document references. Well, so for folks who've looked in the spec at document reference, well, document reference can point to images. It can point to whole other stuff. So we said, OK, we need to back off and say, or not back off, we need to add a category for clinical notes. So query for document reference that are of type clinical notes. Retrieve an encounter note. So this is doing date range searching, doing specific note type searching, and then writing. One of the things we learned about writing, which was a big surprise. Well, I shouldn't say a big surprise. Well, it was a big surprise. The FHIR kind of core team, some of us were talking and thought, when you create these value sets, they go both ways. Like, you're expected to be able to read from these are the vital signs you expect to get back. These are the vital signs you expect to be able to write. Well, we learned actually with clinical notes that some servers are going to let you write in XHTML, but when you retrieve it, they're always going to convert it to a PDF. Okay? Not saying that's the right thing to do. I'm actually making no judgment. That's just what they do. And so how do we let clients know that when you go to write a note, you may be able to write in one format, and you may have to read in a slightly different format. And so we've had a lot of discussions about how do we expose that through the capability statement, how do we expose it in a way that's easy for client app developers. I guess, as I get to the wrap up here, this is my pitch of clinical notes. We're going to spend more time. The Connectathon Scenarios link will be in the presentation for you. We are going to continue testing at the September Baltimore Working Group. I've heard me say that before, but for folks who want to actually do some real testing with Argonaut participants and actually the broader community, many of the folks here will actually lead tracks. We will be in Baltimore in September, and we'd love to have you join us and tell us why we're doing it wrong, or give us some advice on how to make it better. So this is my cheesy "we want you," and in terms of participation, the best way to get in contact with us, the Bulk Data Project, is the Zulip chat or Argonaut, of course, or the Argonaut channel in Zulip. And of course, actually, you can also talk to myself, Eric Haas, Josh Mandel, Dan Gottlieb. We're all around today and tomorrow, and we'd love to have your participation. And I realized at the end, I decided to just throw some links in here. I forget not everyone's, many new folks here. These are kind of, many of these are HL7 links. So there's kind of a FHIR wiki that kind of captures all the work that's going on within FHIR. It's hopefully we'll be off this wiki soon to Confluence, but there's a list of public FHIR servers out there. So if you're trying to figure out, which vendors have, Epic and Cerner, it will take you to their site, and you may have to go through some additional steps to get access, but they are at least all posted there. If you want to look at Connectathon tracks that are planned for September, they're all posted there, and of course, registration for the working group meeting. So that's it. So that's data query in US Core, and happy to take a moment for any questions, but thank you.